Hello, dear listener, and welcome. Tonight, I invite you to settle into a soft space. Whether you're curled under the covers, sipping tea beside a flickering candle, or simply looking for a quiet escape from the noise of the world, you're in the right place. This evening, we'll take a long, gentle walk through a chapter of history that's often told with flames and fury, but not tonight. Tonight we're going to whisper about the witch hunts, not the dramatic version, not the haunted one, but the real one, the human one, the quiet truth behind the fear, the sorrow, and the misunderstanding that shape generations. You might be surprised to learn that many who were called witches never practiced magic at all. They were neighbours, mothers, herbalists, widows, midwives. Tonight we'll talk about who they really were, why they were accused, and how fear became law. There will be no horror here, just soft truth and perhaps a little wonder. Let's begin. Long before the word witch became something to fear, it was something else entirely. In many ancient cultures, the wise woman, or the cunning man, was a figure of trust. Someone who understood the plants, the seasons, and the mysterious rhythms of the body and the earth. These people weren't hiding in shadows or casting wicked spells. They were often the ones you'd go to when a baby was being born, when a fever wouldn't break, or when you had a dream you couldn't explain. They brewed teas, tended wounds, offered prayers, and kept stories passed down from before written language. In pre-Christian Europe, especially among Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic tribes, these traditions were woven deeply into daily life. Celebrations like Samhain, the original root of Halloween, weren't sinister. They were sacred. People lit fires to guide spirits, honoured ancestors, and marked the end of the harvest season. It was never about demons. It was about the turning of time, about death and rebirth, and the belief that the world of the living and the spirit might touch just briefly on nights like that. The women who guided these rituals weren't hiding. They were leading. And yet, as Christianity spread, so too did suspicion. These ancient beliefs didn't fit easily into a growing structure of organised faith. Suddenly the herbs were suspect, the midwives were questioned, the old forest ways were seen as dangerous. What once was healing became heresy, and so, quietly, without much fanfare, a slow transformation began. From trusted to tolerated, from tolerated to feared. The foundation was being laid, not just for a change in faith, but for centuries of suspicion. Still, for many generations, these folkways persisted in the hidden hills of Scotland, in quiet Baltic villages, in mountain huts and winding forests. The old ways lingered, softly, until something shifted, until fear became law. But that part of the story is still to come. As the Roman Empire expanded and Christianity took root across Europe, the landscape of belief began to shift. Where once many gods and goddesses were honoured, where spirits lived in rivers, trees and stars, now there was one God and one path to him. To build a unified faith, church leaders had to draw lines between what was holy and what was heresy, between miracle and magic. Those who continued to practice the old ways, herbalists, seers, diviners, or midwives, were not always condemned outright. In the early centuries of Christian dominance, their work was often quietly tolerated. But unease was growing. Church leaders began writing about maleficium, the idea that certain people could cause harm through spiritual or magical means. Evil, they believed, could be human, and it could be intentional. The Council of Paderborn, in 785 CE under Charlemagne, even issued decrees stating that belief in witches was itself heretical. They claimed if someone believed a woman could ride through the sky or control weather, they were being misled by the devil. Strange, isn't it? The early church denied the existence of witches. It would take centuries for that to change. Over time, as the church gained power and influence, it also began to absorb and reshape the very fears it once dismissed. Folk healing, especially when practiced by women, began to feel dangerous to those in authority. These women didn't speak Latin, they weren't part of the clergy, and perhaps most frightening of all, they answered to no one but themselves. It was not just a matter of belief, it was a matter of control. Midwives and herbalists held knowledge about the human body, childbirth, fertility, and death, topics the church was eager to dominate, and so whispers began to grow. That certain women were in league with the devil, that healing without God's approval might be dangerous. Slowly, carefully, these suspicions crept into law books, sermons, and public discourse. A woman with a strange dream, a child born out of season, a sudden storm that ruins a harvest, it all became suspect, and though the flames of persecution hadn't yet been lit, the kindling had been laid. In time, those whispers would become accusations. Accusations would become trials, and trials would become executions. But that storm was still gathering. Before it arrived, a single book would change everything. It was the year 1487. A German clergyman named Heinrich Kramer, along with Jacob Sprenger, published a book that would ripple through Europe for centuries. Its title, Malleus Maleficarum. Translated, it means the Hammer of Witches. And though not immediately embraced by the church, this book found a powerful audience in civil courts and among fearful populations desperate for control. The Malleus was not a gentle book. It outlined in detail how to identify, question, and ultimately destroy those suspected of witchcraft, particularly women. It insisted that women were more likely to be witches because they were, as the authors wrote, more impressionable, more carnal, and more likely to be deceived by the devil. In short, it was a misogynistic manifesto cloaked in religious authority, and tragically, many listened. Over the next 200 years, Europe would enter a period now called the Great Witch Craze. From the late 1400s to the early 1700s, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people, some scholars say more, were executed for witchcraft across Europe. But it wasn't just the number of deaths that shocks us. It's how it happened, slowly, locally, almost quietly. There was no single witch hunt event. These were not mass purges sweeping across empires. They happened in villages, in small towns, among neighbours. Accusations could start with something small. A cow stopped giving milk. A child fell ill. A crop failed. And someone, usually someone old, poor, widowed or different, was blamed. Often, The accused were exactly the people society had failed to protect. Women who had no husband, midwives who knew how to ease pain in childbirth, herbalists who healed wounds with poultices and teas. In many cases, the trials were driven not by theology, but by fear and desperation. Europe had suffered waves of plague, crops had failed, floods, frosts, and famine haunted the land. People were scared, and fear always looks for a face to blame. Often the confessions extracted from the accused were not voluntary. Torture was common. A woman might be held for hours, questioned without rest, or even physically mutilated to produce proof of guilt. Under such duress, many confessed to whatever was demanded of them. They said they danced with the devil, rode through the sky on broomsticks, attended black Sabbaths. And yet these weren't magical women. These were human beings trying to survive in a world that had turned cold. Germany saw the most executions, followed by Switzerland and France. In some towns, entire families were wiped out by suspicion. In others, children were made to testify against parents. The Malleus Maleficarum was used not as a religious text, but as a manual of destruction. Still, not every country succumbed equally. In Spain and Italy, where the Inquisition was strong, fewer witch trials occurred, perhaps because the Inquisition required more rigorous evidence. In Protestant lands, however, local courts had freer reign. And so the flames spread, not from pulpit to pulpit, but hearth to hearth, among frightened people, in dark winters, with no one left to defend the accused. By now, it may be clear, these so-called witch hunts were rarely about witches, not in the mystical sense, not in the magical sense, and often not even in the spiritual sense. They were about something far more human: fear, power, and very often control. Many of those accused had something in common. They were inconvenient. Sometimes they were outspoken. Sometimes they lived alone. Sometimes they owned land a neighbour or official wanted. And sometimes they simply didn't fit. Let me tell you a story. In a small German village, an elderly woman named Greta was known for her healing salves. She had no husband, no children. One summer, a fever swept through the town. Greta's remedies didn't work for everyone. A child died. The townspeople whispered. How did she know which herbs to use? Why did her chickens always lay more eggs than anyone else's? Why had she never remarried? Within days, Greta was in chains. What happened to Greta was not unique. Throughout Europe and later colonial America, the accused were often vulnerable people. Widows, the mentally ill, the disabled women past childbearing age, or those who simply lived on the outskirts of social or religious life. In Scotland, witches were sometimes denounced for dancing or singing or appearing in a dream. In France, women who used contraception herbs were labelled as devil's tools because they threatened male control over lineage. In England, a midwife could be accused of witchcraft if a child died during birth, even when that death was due to infection, breech position, or lack of sanitation. Some cases were shockingly political. In towns where land was limited, accusing a woman of witchcraft could mean her land was confiscated and redistributed to the accuser. And tragically, many women were forced to name others to avoid execution. A friend, a neighbour, sometimes even their own daughter. In that way, the witch hunts functioned much like social purges, targeting not just belief systems, but vulnerability itself. They were a way to maintain order, a way to channel collective anxiety, a way to protect the powerful by sacrificing the powerless. And yet, through it all, resistance flickered. In some towns, priests refused to read the accusations. In others, neighbours risked everything to defend the accused. These moments were rare, but they mattered. They remind us the witch hunts were not a mass delusion. They were a system, one built by people, fueled by fear, and allowed to burn until someone said, enough. And in one small corner of the world, across the Atlantic, the flames would rise once again. Across the ocean, in a small Puritan colony in Massachusetts, a new chapter in the story of witch hunts was quietly beginning. The year was 1692, and the village was called Salem. The land was cold, the community strict. Life in Salem was hard. There were tensions over land, harsh winters, sickness, and fear of nearby indigenous attacks. But the most potent source of tension, each other. And so it started, as many of these things did, with children. 2 young girls in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris began behaving strangely. They convulsed, they screamed, they claimed to see visions, and soon they accused 3 women of bewitching them. The accused were easy targets: Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; Sarah Osborne, an older woman who rarely attended church. All 3 fit the pattern we've come to recognise: women on the margins. What followed was not just a local panic, it was a cascade. The more people were accused, the more others rushed to accuse their neighbours to avoid suspicion themselves. It spiralled. By the end, over 200 people had been accused of witchcraft. 19 were hanged. One, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with stones after refusing to enter a plea. Others died in prison. Many more lived in fear, knowing their fate could change with a whispered rumour. The trials were chaotic. There was no real evidence, only spectral evidence. That is, testimony that the spirit of someone had harmed another in a vision or dream. This meant a person could be condemned based on what another simply claimed to have seen. No proof, no witnesses, no defence. Eventually, doubt crept in. As accusations reached wealthier, more respected families, public opinion shifted. People began to ask, what if this wasn't about witches at all? What if this was about fear, about power, about control? In 1693, the governor of Massachusetts halted the trials. Later, he declared a day of fasting and soul-searching. Some of the families of the executed were compensated. Others never recovered, and Salem would forever become a symbol of how reason can dissolve when fear takes hold. But Salem, as tragic as it was, did mark a turning point. After Salem, the tide began to turn. A new age was dawning, one of science, enlightenment, and eventually apology. As the 1700s unfolded, something in the collective mind began to shift. Slowly, quietly, the age of enlightenment crept in. Science was gaining ground. Philosophers questioned the divine right of kings. Physicians began to understand disease as biology, not bewitchment. And most importantly, doubt began to take root. How could an invisible spirit harm someone? How could accusations stand without evidence? Why were so many of the accused the elderly, the poor, or the odd? Judges, once quick to condemn, began asking harder questions. Laws changed. In Prussia, France and England, legal reforms were introduced that made witch trials nearly impossible. The death penalty for witchcraft was repealed in many places. Trials continued in some corners of Europe well into the 1700s, but the public appetite for them was fading. In Scotland, one of the last countries to abandon formal witch trials, a woman named Janet Horne was executed in 1727. She was elderly, confused, likely suffering from dementia. Her daughter had deformities, and neighbours said she had ridden the girl like a horse. She was burned alive. 20 years later, witch trials were formally outlawed, and then silence. The flames died down, but the stories did not disappear. In some rural places, old beliefs lingered. Even into the 1800s, women were still sometimes accused of casting the evil eye, or cursed behind closed doors. But the days of sanctioned executions were over. The world had changed, and with that change came a strange kind of forgetting. We remembered the image of the witch, crooked hat, broomstick, boiling cauldron, but we forgot the truth, that the vast majority of those executed were not spellcasters, not Satanists, not monsters. They were women and men and children caught in the tide of fear, punished not for what they did, but for who they were, and what others thought they were. And now, in the modern world, we use the term witch hunt to describe political persecution or mob mentality, but few pause to remember what that phrase once truly meant, or who was lost because of it. Today the term witch hunt is used often, in political speeches, in headlines, in heated arguments, on social media. It's become a shorthand, a way to claim unjust persecution. But when we use those words casually, do we remember where they came from? Do we remember that real people died under that banner? That they were tortured, hanged, burned, drowned? That children lost mothers, towns lost healers, and knowledge was erased? To call something a witch hunt is to invoke a deep legacy of fear and loss, but it also reveals something more. It shows how the pattern continues. The real story of witch hunts isn't about spells or broomsticks. It's about how quickly a society can turn on its own, how suspicion, once planted, can spread like fire, how difference, once feared, becomes danger, and how systems, once set in motion, become nearly impossible to stop. In the 1950s, during the Red Scare in the United States, Senator Joseph McCarthy led a campaign to root out alleged communists. It was aggressive, fear-based, evidence-light. Many careers were ruined. It was called a modern-day witch hunt. And the comparison wasn't wrong, because like Salem, like the villages of Bavaria, like the moors of Scotland, it wasn't magic that people feared. It was the unfamiliar, the non-conforming, the ones who challenged the accepted order. And still today, in corners of the world, there are communities where witch hunts continue, not as metaphors, but as real acts of violence against women and children, accused of bringing bad luck or disease. The story is not over. But if we remember, truly remember, perhaps it won't be repeated. And now we come to the end of this long, quiet journey. We've wandered through centuries of stories, not ones of witches and curses, but stories of people, of fear and hope, of loss and remembrance. The truth about witch hunts isn't fiery or loud. It's soft, quiet, like a sigh in the night. It's a truth that speaks to something deep in the human spirit. Our need to explain the unexplainable. Our tendency to fear what we don't understand, and the cost of letting fear rule the day. And yet, in the ashes of these old stories, something tender remains. The memory of women who healed, men who dreamed differently, children who spoke when others stayed silent. They may have been called witches, but they were also teachers, listeners, keepers of quiet wisdom. Their legacy isn't gone. It lives on in those who seek truth gently, who question boldly but with compassion, and who believe that history, when remembered kindly, can become a guide instead of a warning. So now, wherever you are, in a small apartment or a countryside cabin, in the stillness of a city night or the hush of a rural dawn, let this story settle around you like a warm quilt. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts soften. And know that even in the darkest chapters of the past, there were always flickers of light. And tonight, you carry that light. Sleep well and good night.